I feel a bit more depressed about what have I been doing with my life. But you can have a look at his CV on the app. Paul is a lecturer in primary care. He's also the research director for the Irish Centre for Applied Patient Safety and Simulation. And if that isn't enough, he's also the co-director of the Diploma and Masters in Patient Safety and Simulation. So I'll pass you over to Paul.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Thank you for staying. I appreciate that maybe you want to be somewhere else, but I'm going to do my best to make it worthwhile. So this was the title that I submitted. You know, they ask you to do this 4 or 5 months in the past. I'm representing the Irish Association for Simulation. So this was the title that I gave, and then I thought about this last week, and I didn't know how to answer it. So I changed my title slightly. So I think you guys all know how to deliver education, and maybe you know how to deliver research as well. But I'm just going to focus on the research end of it, because I think we don't have time to talk about education and research. I'm going to focus on research in retrospect. I should have thought of this at the beginning. So this is my first simulation center, which is actually the Naval Experimental Diving Unit, which is in the Panhandle of Florida. They call it the Redneck Riviera. And it was a big place for spring break, which made it kind of interesting to be there. So they have 120 military divers. They have medical personnel. They have civilian researchers. And they have a whole support staff. And their goal is to test and evaluate diving, hyperbaric, and other life support systems and procedures. And we also do research in biomedical and environmental physiology. So that's what they did. This is what they have. They have this big ocean simulation facility that can simulate depth to 790 meters. They can make it cold. They can make it hot. They have a test pool that they can make cold and hot. They have an environmental chamber that they can make it cold and hot and windy. And I spent many miserable hours, I can tell you, in all of these different places, feeling very cold or very hot, and a lot of cycling underwater, even though divers never cycle to work. But that's what they spend their time doing. So it was quite miserable to be a test subject there. This is where I am now. So now I'm located in Galway in Ireland, and we're at the Irish Centre for Applied Patient Safety. So we have medical director, I'm the research director. We have some technicians, 1.5 of them, some lecturers, teaching fellows, and some PhDs and postgraduate students. And our mission there is to improve patient safety and quality of care. So quite different from the experimental diving unit. We only have 2,500 square feet, so that's actually only 2 rooms we have to do everything in. And we do our best, small, but I think we're pretty busy. But when you compare these 2 simulation centers, so NEDU, the diving unit, we had readily available research participants. We don't have those. We had lots of support staff. We had proper funding agencies that were there to support what we were doing. Now I write 120-page applications, and I've realized that I'm more successful in not getting grants than I am. So that's my special skill, I think, is writing grants that I mostly don't get. We have the experimental diving unit, a very well-defined purpose and specific goals about what it was for. We did mandatory exercise in the morning at 7 o'clock, don't do that. And our boss, Dara Burns, doesn't let us finish early on Fridays either. And there's a bit of a risk of injury, which we don't have in ICAPSS. So when you compare this from the purposes of doing research, how many of you are like the experimental diving unit with just a big research staff and lots of people just ready to participate in any research that you want, no matter how ridiculous it is? 1. You're at RCSI, you probably buy in all these people as well. Okay. Most of you, I assume, are like ICAPSS, where your main goal is delivering training and you do your best to do a little bit of research on the side. Would that be true? So it's much more challenging to do research in this environment, as you know, than it is when you have everything laid out for you. So there's 2 different types of healthcare simulation. I'm going to talk about these 2 broad types. So one is research about simulation. So this is where the focus is on the simulation itself. So I want to know about simulation. I want to know whether it's effective. I want to know who it works with and why. And then the other broad type is research through simulation. So this is where the focus of your research is not on the simulation itself, but rather you're using simulation to do something else. Like here I said, test different type of alarms, or maybe you're looking at different equipment, or you're looking at procedures. But it's not, the focus is not on does simulation work or how does it work. It's on we're just using simulation as a vehicle to do something else. So I want you to keep those 2 broad types of simulation in your head. So we wondered what people did. So what were the most impactful simulation studies that were out there? And I mean, I have some issue with defining impact as research, but we'll get to that again later too. But the whole idea is here, we wanted to look at what was the most impactful research by considering in terms of what was the most highly cited research. So we did a search. This is called a bibliometric review. It's quite a painful process, actually, as it turned out. We thought it'd be very easy, but it's actually not as easy as you might think. So we did this in not 2017, in 2017. We searched Scopus, and it will tell you how many citations all of these different papers would have, and we took the top 100. This is the number of studies. If you just type in healthcare simulation or simulation-based medical education, you can see there's been a huge growth in research over the last decades. And it's a good slide to show you if you want to. There's no causality here. I think just because ASPE was founded in 2009 does not mean there was then research. So this is an association. We can't draw a causal link. But we can see a huge, unsurprising, huge growth in recent years in terms of how much simulation is being done. And it looks like it's gone down in 2017, but it didn't. That's just because we did it in July 2017. These were the top 5 most cited simulation-based research studies. So this randomized control trial looking at VR training. Then we have some systematic reviews, and then we have Erickson's papers that I still make my students read on deliberate practice. So these are the most cited of the 5 studies. If you look at what kind of papers were in the top 100, so the majority were concerned with some aspect of education and training. So does simulation work in a kind of training education perspective? And 28% of those were concerned with looking at the effectiveness of an intervention. Surgery was the most common specialty. I was kind of surprised by that. But of those papers, the surgery was the most common. And actually, if you look even deeper than that, it's laparoscopic surgery that is the most common type of surgery that studies. And I wondered maybe if laparoscopic surgery just kind of lends itself quite nicely. You can have the lap boxes, and maybe simulation was kind of growing at the same time as laparoscopic surgery was growing. So maybe that's why. And the most common journals were of the publications actually in surgery journals. Technical skills were evaluated the most, 45% of these papers. Non-technical, 25%, and then there was a kind of mix in the others. And a lot of them were concerned with narrative or systematic reviews of studies. And I think there's going to be more of this over time. If we were to look in 5 years' time, I think there'll be more systematic reviews because we've built, you can see from the previous slides, like we've built this body of evidence now. All this evidence is coming on. All these single studies are coming through. And now there's quite a lot of information there to allow us to do systematic or narrative reviews that maybe there wasn't back in kind of 2004. So we built all of this evidence to work from. So I would argue, some of you may argue differently, but I think the burden of proof around simulation has largely been addressed, at least at some level. So I think if you look at what we're doing in the sim centers, if we look at behaviors, if we look at attitudes, if we look at knowledge, if we look at those kind of lower levels of Kirkpatrick's evaluation hierarchy, I think there's a sufficient body of evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness of simulation. But what that leaves is these kind of more nuanced and complex questions that are actually probably much harder, or I would argue are much harder for small centers to answer. And I have 2 examples here, and I'm going to discuss those. So one of those is, does your simulation-based intervention have a clinically relevant or clinically meaningful impact? So that's one type of study, or that's one question. And then also the big issue here is, how do you take this intervention that may work in a single center and scale that? And we can look at effectiveness across a whole load of different centers. We want to show that this intervention can work and can generalize and work in other domains. So here's the first one. So I'm going to show you an example. So we wanted to assess the efficacy of simulation-based education using something called precision teaching, which I'll tell you about. We wanted to see if we could improve the performance of pediatric trainees doing pediatric lumbar puncture. So our intervention group was 10 senior house officers, and then we had these comparison groups. We wanted to have meaningful comparison groups rather than just a control group who hadn't done the training. We wanted something meaningful. So we wanted to compare them to people who actually do this. So we wanted to compare them to the regs in both the simulation setting, but we also wanted to take this out to the hospital and look at whether this was actually having an impact in the number of successful lumbar punctures performed by our pediatricians. So some of you may not know what precision teaching is. So what it is, it's a very pedantic way of teaching. It's a bit like it's a bit like deliberate practice or mastery training, but there's this fluency criterion. So you have to be able to perform the task correctly within a period of time. So the notion here is there's no point performing the task correctly if it takes you hours to do. So you want to be able to perform the task within somewhere close to the time that an expert would be able to perform this task. So we're trying to make this meaningful. So not just correct, you have to do it within a particular time. There's frequency building, so you get feedback, and you, the trainee, keep doing this task until you get it right. And we assess as you're going whether growth has occurred. So we watch you as you go, as you're training, to see how well you're performing this task. And then if you're not performing particularly well, we might go back and we might change the intervention. We might go back and say for you, okay, you need to practice this step a few more times because you seem to be struggling here. So it's kind of like sort of a live intervention, I suppose, which might change as we do it. So we did a task analysis. So we worked with experts, and we developed this 24-step task analysis for how you should perform this task. And we measured the time of experts, and they had to do it within, I think, one standard deviation of that time that the experts were able to do it in. And this is what we found. So at baseline, before we'd done any training, the first time they came in and did the task, about 30%. Then after a mean of 5 trials, so we didn't need 6,000 like the guys in Formula One. So maybe these guys are smarter than the guys that change tires. I don't know. They didn't need 6,000 trials to reach fluency. They needed 5 trials. So this means on their final training, they got 100%. It was stable, and what that meant was even when we were distracting them by asking them stupid questions about whether they wanted to be, I can't remember, a goose or a duck, or what was the last book that they read, they were able to do this task, because that's the kind of definition of fluency. You're able to do this. You're so skilled at this task, you can do it even when we're distracting you. And then even after a period of 2 to 3 months, they were still able to perform this task at close to 100%. You can see our control group were performing about 60%. So our control group were pediatric registrars who are really doing this task out in the real world on real babies. And they were about 60% compared to our guys who we trained, and in five trials, they were able to reach 100%. You can see the mean training time was 95 minutes. So not an enormous period of time. But this is the kind of okay, that's fine, great. We were able to do that in the simulator. But this is the more interesting part, is does this transfer out into the real world when you're doing this on real babies? And we found that our trained group, they did 12 LPs, 11 were successful, 1 was not. Our control group did 45, 25 were successful, and 20 were not. And because of our small numbers, you find that actually this difference is not significant, because we were a small center with a small number of pediatricians in our university, so we didn't find a significant difference, even though I guess if we had more, this would be significant. But I would suggest this is clinically meaningful. Okay, so maybe what's not really in the paper are some of the challenges that we had around this, which I'm going to tell you now. So sometimes I think when you write a journal paper, it's like the Disney version of what happened. So I'm not suggesting that you lie, but it's a sort of Disney version where all the animals are friends and everybody gets on. There's normally like a bit of dirt behind it. So here's some of the dirt. It was hard to get our trainees to buy into this. They thought we were being way too pedantic. We really struggled to get them to buy in. They had a bit of an attitude that, at some point this was good enough. They didn't want perfection. They weren't, and I didn't ask the question to the guy this morning, but I mean, maybe the Formula One guys, they want perfection. It's funny, the trainees, they thought there was something, this was good enough. If I can get to 80% in 3 trials, that's enough. We don't need to come back and do any more. So they didn't want 100%. I don't know what to tell you about that. So it's challenging to get them to do it. The other problem with junior doctors is they move. So after 3 months, they're not in your hospital anymore, and Brahman over there had to chase them all over Ireland to get them to do some of these follow-up tasks to see if they were still fluent. That was also a challenge. Even though we only had 10 subjects in our hospital, this took 7 people to run. So we needed people from the university, the sim center. We needed people that worked in pediatrics. So there's a big, large group of people were required to run this study. So I've only given you the cost of consumables. So that cost 4,200 euros just for the consumables for this trial. We tried to work out some of the other numbers. I think it would be, if we were really, what does this really cost? I think this is 20 or 30,000 if we were to put in everybody's time and everything that went with it. And we were limited by the fact that we only had a population of 10 SHOs. So this study was powered to look at it in the simulation center. So, but it wasn't powered for this. We didn't really know how many LPs that they were going to do. So this was the unknown. So it wasn't powered for this, unfortunately. But it was powered for, we were expecting a large effect size, and we found a large effect size. We didn't need a large, so it was powered sufficiently. So we struggled to get this paper published. This is quite cathartic for me. I'm glad we could spend this time together. So the first one I quite like, sort of. This is the one that you read and you get really cross and then close the thing and think. So yeah, it was quite boring to read, apparently. Okay, one of the other reviewers didn't like our comparison group because they were too, although I think the comparison group was clinically relevant, it was relevant, then the control group who got nothing. They thought there's too many levels of experience and expertise. We didn't have those guys kind of tight enough for a randomized control trial. And I do agree the number of lumbar punctures performed by the intervention group was small. But this was hard. And I don't even know if we could do this anymore. Ireland has a very kind of strict rules around data protection now. They've taken some kind of crazy, I think for the rest of you, the GDPR, I know it's an issue. I think in Ireland it's even more of an issue. So I'm actually not sure if we could even do this, because I don't know, it's not feasible to consent to patients. I don't even know if we could do this kind of transfer of training study anymore. And then one of them helpfully said, had we considered conducting a multi-site study to improve the number of participants? And I think we, as a group in ICAPSS, have said we were never, ever doing another precision teaching study because they're so hard to control and manage. So this was hard to do. So this was a does simulation works in our kind of study. We wanted to see if it transferred through into the clinical environment. It was very difficult to pull off. So even with, we had some funding, we had a multidisciplinary team, it was challenging to run this as a tight experimental study that was kind of acceptable to peer review. We struggled. That was about the third journal we sent that to. We really struggled to get this into a journal, even though I do think it has a bit of a story to say. And because we wanted this clinically meaningful impact. And I guess we didn't present our work in an entertaining way. So I don't know what to tell you about that. So be very entertaining in your work. So I was feeling quite sorry for myself until this study came out. And then I started to feel some sorry for some new people who'd had an even greater nightmare than we had with our study. I don't know if any of these people are here. I'd like to meet them because this was painful. This is out in BMJ Quality and Safety very recently. So they followed the reviewer's advice and scaled a study that had been found to be effective in one site, which makes sense. They wanted to see whether this interpartum emergency training package would have an impact on the ABCAR score of babies in the first 5 minutes at 12 large maternity hospitals across Scotland. So a very brave study, I think. And so that was their plan. And what this intervention was, you do the train-the-trainer program, and then once you train the guys, they go off back to their units, and then they train the staff there and kind of pass on the good training. And it was to cover core obstetric emergencies. They wanted to train all the staff within 12 months. And like I said, this had demonstrated to be an effective intervention in single-site studies. Apart from now, the poor Scottish people got a bit of a surprise here. So 87,000 eligible births. They found 1,200 babies had an ABCAR score of less than 5 in the first 5 minutes. And they actually found their intervention had no reduction in the proportion of term babies. So all of this work, all of these 12 sites doing this, and they didn't find that this was effective. Even though it had been effective, there was plenty of evidence to show this was effective. So why was this? So I think this is an issue, or not me, I agree with the authors, that this was probably an implementation issue rather than an issue with the intervention themselves. It's to how do you scale these interventions. So there was variability in how it was implemented across the 12 units, because you can't control that so easily. Some of the units didn't start the training when they were supposed to, so there was a delay, and then that affects their step wedge design. They didn't have funding to support data collection by the staff in the unit, so they didn't actually know what percentage of the unit had gone through the training. They thought perhaps that you needed 90% in order for this intervention to be effective, and they didn't think that in some of the units they got that 90%. And then even worse, this is when I felt really sorry for them. There was another intervention, something else was going on at the same time, and this other training program has sometimes contradictory issues. They said contradictory things to the other training, and so that kind of contaminated the whole thing. So I felt sorry for myself, and then I felt really sorry for these guys. But having said that, it's fantastic. This is a brilliant study for me here. I talk about this with my students, and I've been sharing this wide and far because I think it's very important because it shows how complicated this is, and it shows how complex it is to take an intervention and scale that in a way that it can be implemented across different places. And maybe it shows that actually doing simulation-based research is different from clinical trials because of some of these issues they had here. So they found that it was much more difficult than anticipated, and they suggested further research is required to understand why this positive effect in a single unit, it couldn't be replicated across multiple units. So to summarize, so I've been talking about research about simulation and whether simulation is effective. So I think that the current question, we've largely demonstrated, like I say, that simulation works at some level. So the remaining questions, I think, are much more challenging to answer. And because of that, I think they're much more challenging for a small simulation center kind of working on its own to do. So it requires a research team. I think it requires probably cooperation across sites, but you can even see then that's not easy to do. You need all your sites to do exactly the same things when they're doing it, which is tricky. Requires resources, support, expertise. This is not a small thing that we're getting into here. And so I think for us, we can see that there's big challenges for a busy education-focused center to successfully execute maybe and answer some of these bigger questions. But that doesn't mean I'm suggesting no one does any research. I have an answer for all your problems. It's a good thing you stayed. I can get this to go. So why don't we consider a different type of research for our small, poorly funded research? What about research through simulation? So this is where we are using simulation to answer some other kind of problem. We're not looking at whether simulation is effective. We're testing our procedures. I'm going to get into this. We're testing equipment. We're looking at the working environment. We're using simulation as a tool for doing something else. If you look in the aviation simulation literature, there's not a big literature looking at the effectiveness of simulation. They kind of accept that, but they use it to do other things that look at cockpit design, for example, look at when mishaps go wrong. So using other stuff, we can do other things. And that's what mostly people do in other high-risk industries that use simulation. They're not spending loads of time looking at whether all these different helicopter simulators, which one produces more effective pilots. They're using these simulators to do other things, and I think we're missing a trick here. So myself and Dara went through the presentations there just before we did this, and we categorized them as this type of research. And we found 13% of the posters or the presentations at this conference are of this type of research. So some of us are doing it, but I think there's a real opportunity here to do more of this kind of research. So for example, in aviation, they refly adverse events. That's what they do. If an airplane crashes anywhere in the world, companies all over the world are testing that scenario the next day. When I was in the U.S. Navy, same thing with their naval aviation mishaps. If a F-18 or whatever crashed, they were there studying what was on. They used simulation as a tool to look at what the crew did, why it happened, were the buttons in the wrong place, what happens if you put a similarly trained crew in the same situation, does the same thing happen? So you can get so much information from this. I'm not saying we can do exactly the same as aviation, but I think we can do some of this. I advised on an adverse event in an ICU unit. They had all the same kind of data that they would get from a black box, more or less. And we could have recreated that scenario. We could have reflown that scenario and see what would have happened. So there's so much learning that can come out of that. So I think that's one example of what we could be doing. We could test protocols. We could build protocols using simulation. So we can take our protocols into the simulator and look and see how they work, particularly for those protocols that don't get exercised very often. And we can make changes based on how teams are performing. Does anyone do that? I mean, I sense that some of this is going on, but I guess it's not making it through. Maybe there's not really a forum to put this into the research literature. So I guess some of this is happening, but it's not kind of filtering through somehow. But I think it's a really good way to use simulation. And again, this is what they do in aviation. They don't just send this, they don't just put they buy a new plane. They don't just fire you out there and say, here, we've written these things on the back of an envelope. You go and try them out and tell me whether they work or not. They do this really carefully in the simulator beforehand and look and see whether these are the right protocols. So we do a bit of this. So this is an example. This poster's here, actually. This is from our research group. So we looked at the protocol for massive blood transfusions of code reds. They have 48 of these a year, roughly, or they had in 2018 in our local hospital. And they recognized they needed to raise awareness of this. They had some issue that it was turning it off was a big issue. The blood would just keep coming and coming and coming and coming. Which I guess in a sense isn't directly a safety issue, but it certainly is a waste of resources, and it's quite costly to have that blood keep coming. And so we did a pilot session where we tested these protocols out in the simulator, and they got to kind of work with them. And now we can make changes to these protocols, and then we can put them back in again, and we can try again using a kind of quality improvement kind of PDSA approach. So we can do lots here to improve, to have impacts and help locally, and really bring in the hospital into this and into our sim center to improve the care of our patients. That's one of our examples. We can test equipment. So, I mean, how often does the real end user get to test healthcare equipment and make purchasing decisions? Who decides who purchases decisions in your hospitals? Who decides what equipment you purchase? Maybe you've got some senior clinical people involved, maybe you don't. But we don't really, now we have a way, and the problem is what equipment do the hospitals want to buy? So you have it, A, it costs €1,000, B, it costs €500. Which equipment do they want to buy? They always go cheap. But maybe that upfront cost, maybe there's a cost further down the line in terms of it, maybe it's so crap, the stuff keeps breaking, we have to buy more, and no one can use it. So now we could be using simulation to demonstrate this. And now we have kind of objective data to say, I want, cannula A, because we tested it here, and look, it works really well, or it's much easier to use, or there's less spillage, or whatever. And we can get our end users now involved in choosing equipment. And we can test equipment. We can get our end users involved in designing equipment as well. And we can test this in our lab in a controlled environment to see whether it works. So I don't have a healthcare example. I have an example where I tested some heating pads that SEALs, Special Forces, use. So the SEALs have this thing called a SEAL delivery vehicle. What that is that submarine there. The problem with the SEAL delivery vehicle is that you're flooded. All the water is in it. So the SEALs were upset because they were being delivered, and they were really cold when they were delivered out of their vehicle, and they felt this was affecting their ability to do their mission. So one of them, essentially on the internet, found these heating pads. I'm going to show you what they are. For those of you with Volvos, what they really are just those pads, the things under the seats of cars. When you press them, they make it hot. They are essentially those, and you plug them into a battery. Anyway, that's what they found to solve all of their kind of cold problems. So we tested these to see if they had an impact either on their physiologically, or they had an impact on their cognitive performance. So we got 7 SEALs, and we put them in our test pool at a cold temperature, and we tested them with and without the heating pads. So you can see the guy on the left. You can see that it's not the most sophisticated piece of equipment that you've ever seen in all your life, but they like them. And then that's what they were kind of dressed in. So they call this a semi-dry suit, but this is like a half full, half empty kind of thing. Because although it's a semi-dry suit, that also means it's a semi-wet suit. So it's not that you stayed semi-dry. You really just get wet. I don't know why they call it a semi-dry suit, but it has kind of dry suit fitting, so the water doesn't flow quite as freely through it as it would otherwise. So there he is, and then you have these heating pads on underneath, and they're supposed to keep you warm. And we kind of counterbalanced the design. This is what we found with the rectal temperature. Now, I have the heating on button there. So the heaters weren't allowed to be turned on until they'd been in there for 10 minutes, because I burnt some SEALs prior to this. Because unless your semi-dry suit was also semi-wet, it got a bit too toasty in there, and they kind of came out with these big red pads. So we had to be flooded before we could turn them on. So the ethics people were pretty cross at me about that, but they let us continue because, I don't know, they let me continue. So you might notice, for the eagle-eyed view, the people without the heating, so when you were in the unheated condition, you were actually warmer. So you're warmer throughout, which is okay, that's fine. But the problem for me was you were also warmer in the first 10 minutes when you should have been the same. Don't exactly have an explanation for why that was. Maybe you get yourself dressed more carefully. I couldn't blind them. We didn't have enough heating pads to blind everybody into what condition they were in, so they knew. So even got kind of going, so I don't know what to tell you about that. But you can see certainly that the heating pad people's rectums got colder, I guess, as the study went on compared to the other guys. So that was their proxy for core temperature, I guess. If you look at their finger temperature, it was even worse in the first 10 minutes. But you can see they still got colder in the heated condition than in the unheated condition. So science, and also there was no impact on cognitive performance. So you really have to be, I mean, you guys probably know this. Before you kind of go off your cognitive cliff, you have to be basically dying before you can compensate for a very, very long time before it really starts to have a big cognitive impact on performance. So we weren't allowed to do that to them, even though I think they probably would have done. They're very good test subject, SEALs. I have to say, I recommend them, because they just do whatever you say and they don't care. I think being a SEAL really is an ability to suffer. If you don't mind suffering, then I think you're a great SEAL. Okay, you have to be able to swim a bit and run a bit, but it's mostly about just not minding if you suffer. They're saying that if you don't mind, it doesn't matter. So I think there's a lot of comfort in that. But anyway, I'm digressing with my stories. So it doesn't have any impact on your cognitive performance, and it makes you colder. So your risk of hypothermia is greater with the heating pads. So do you think they bought them? Who says yes, they use them? Okay, who says no, they don't? I'm afraid it's yes. The SEALs liked the pads. They didn't enjoy my science experiment that we'd done to show that their pads weren't effective. And so despite me saying, actually, you're at higher risk of hyperthermia, they just did not care. They liked them, they made them feel good, and they weren't going to listen to some soft-handed psychologist telling them how to do business. This cost $250,000. So I don't know what that's about. Hopefully your equipment testing when you do it is more successful than mine. But at least they know this. I mean, I told them, I can't make them do what I ask, I guess. But I mean, so science says don't do them, but they use it anyway. So that's equipment. You could also use simulation to test the working environment. So you can test the physical layout of where you work. If you're building a new hospital, we can run a simulation through that and see how it goes and make changes. So I said they're building a new children's hospital in the Republic of Ireland, which I think is one of the most expensive hospitals on Earth and continues to get more and more expensive. I said, okay, that's great. Did you mock this up and run anything through? No, it's too late for that. I said, can you at least kind of change where you're going to put the plugs? No, it's too late for that. We've chosen where the plugs are. So they're going to get this big, huge, billion-euro children's hospital. And my big worry is that everything's going to be in the wrong place and it won't work properly. And they could have fixed this if they just did a little bit of work around simulation. Again, the military know this. They build cardboard mock-ups of things, and then they do even more sophisticated things with virtual reality. They don't build all this stuff without testing it out first in a simulated environment. So we can do this. All right, this is an example from our local hospital have a new psychiatry unit. So they built this new psychiatry. It's very beautiful looking. Kind of got nice curves, sort of relaxing. It's not it's on the same site as the hospital, but it's kind of somewhere else. So we ran a mock code in the psychiatric unit, and it was very eye-opening. Firstly, because it's separated from the rest of the hospital, the ambulance has to go there to pick up the patient. But the ambulance men didn't know where it was. It didn't have its own postcode. So it took them a while to get there. Then they got there, and the staff had parked their cars all over the car park, so the ambulance couldn't get to the loading bay. And then, of course, when you have a code, you open the doors, and because it's a psychiatric unit, the staff and the patients all wear kind of civilian clothes. So nobody knew who was who, and so some of the patients sort of wandered out the door while the mock code was going on. And then, of course, there was some... they needed more training in ACLS. The head of the bed wouldn't go down. So all of these, okay, so the unit is built, but at least they've taken this on board in order to kind of look at this. And because of this, they've made changes to how things work. The ambulance guys know where the psychiatric unit is now. They're not allowed to park across the loading bay. They've fixed the beds. So and then you can go back and you can look at this again using kind of PDSA and maybe we're taking a quality improvement approach to this, but that could be turned into more of a kind of research quality improvement if we wanted to. But now we're really having impact. It's not that we wrote a paper that maybe 10 people will cite ever if we're lucky. But now we're having impact in our local hospital for the taxpayers that pay all our salaries, and we're doing something good to improve the healthcare of the patients. So again, there's a lot of scope there. We can look at the system. We can look at how the system is arranged to see if we can improve that. So here's an example where this is pretty mean. So you get the poor guys when they're just coming off their shift, they then give them some horrible arrests to manage in the simulation center before they're allowed to go home to bed. But you can do that, and we could test different shift schedules and look and see how people perform at the end of their shift. So there's so much that can be done here as well if we can get management and everyone to buy in to here's a really useful thing we can do with our center, and we can really improve the quality of the care that we're delivering. So although this isn't the main focus of most of our research, actually, as you can see, there's massive, I don't know how to, I want to come here and shake everybody. There's massive scope here to do so much good work, and it's not going to kill us all to do it. We can do really useful things. We don't have to do randomized control trials. We don't have to have millions of euros and and statisticians and everybody to set this up. We can do very useful things that are having big impact locally with the kind of the facilities that we have. And there's a possibility we start with this quality improvement, but then it can shift over into more of a research focus as well. So I think the opportunities here are huge. I have this because I used to have to do presentations to admirals to explain how you'd spent their money. And I went to the admiral and I said, look, we've found this out, but we need some more money to find something else out. He just kind of rolled his eyes. He said, research is like a self-licking ice cream cone. He said, do you ever finish research and just get an answer? All he wanted was the answer. And I said, no, well, you kind of can, but there's always more questions. But I think it's important. Research publication is not a product of research, despite what my university thinks and despite what my promotion board may think. It's not a product of research. It shows you've done some research, but again, if only 10 people ever read your paper, or it's not having an effect. So I think we can do this impactful research in a way that doesn't kill us all, and really bring about change and make things better for everybody. And I think it still can be published. So I think it's a really feasible approach for maybe smaller and larger simulation centers to really have impact on patient safety and quality of care. We do meaningful work, and it doesn't have to be a randomized control trial to have an impact. Okay, I'm finished. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Any questions for Paul?
Thanks, Paul. I come across a lot of people trying to do simulation for learning and systems testing at the same time. So it's kind of trying to, for participant learning, and they're also doing system testing as well. And I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. Have you got any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's a big challenge. I think something's going to compromise. You could see with our, maybe it can be done, but it's challenging, and now you've got two masters, and it could be maybe the problem. Maybe you can pull off. I don't know. I think it's much trickier. But now you've kind of got two things you're trying to do. So maybe a bit like buying a washer dryer. Maybe you're better off, not buying the washer dryer that doesn't do either of those tasks properly, and actually separating them. If you want to look at the learners, then look at the learners. If you want to look at the system, then look at the system and do it properly. So I think it creates much more challenge, and I think sometimes one part of that might get compromised. So yeah, I'm with you on that. It wouldn't be my recommendation, I guess.
Thanks, Paul. And one more question, last question.
Yeah, so John Page from New Orleans. I appreciate your redneck Riviera comment, but just go a little bit further.
Very sophisticated down New Orleans.
Further east, and you'll go to watercolor, and it's beautiful out there. There are not that many people. But I appreciate the systems-based focus.